Hello from Halifax. This is Jo with Jo to the World Creations, and today we're going to learn how to single crochet. When making your first single crochet stitch, it's important to understand where to make that stitch. Normally, when you're making a single crochet stitch into the chain row here, you're going to be working into the second chain from the hook. But let's take a closer look at what that means. The loop that's on our hook right now does not count. That is our working loop. The next chain that's attached to this working loop is the first chain from the hook. The next chain is the second chain from the hook. And often when making single crochet stitches, this is the chain that you're going to be working into. Now, some patterns say to do something different, and that's okay. And you're welcome to single crochet into the third chain from hook or the fourth chain from hook, whatever the pattern calls for. But typically, when you're making a single crochet stitch into the chain row, you're going to be working into the second chain from the hook. Now let's take a closer look at these chain stitches that we've made to understand where we should be working into. So as I mentioned, we're going to work into the second chain from hook, which is normally where you'll work into. But there's a few places that you can actually insert your hook to make your first single crochet stitch. So the most common place is to insert your hook under the top loop of the chain stitch, which means that we insert our hook directly underneath that top loop. And you'll see once you've inserted your hook into under that top loop, you have two strands that are making a bit of an X underneath the hook. So that is how you're going to work into the top loop of the chain. So I'm going to pick up my hook with my dominant hand, and how I hold my yarn is like this, and I have a whole post on different ways to hold your yarn so you can do what works best for you. So I'm going to take my hook. My working loop right now is on the shaft of my hook, and I am going to insert my hook with the head of the hook facing me under that top loop of the second chain. Now we're going to do something called yarning over, which means to bring our yarn, see the yarn that I'm pulling on, over our hook. So I still have the head of the hook facing me, and I'm going to push the hook backwards away from me while at the same time bringing the yarn over the hook. You can see that it's falling, the yarn is falling over the hook from the bottom right to the top left. And this is the process of yarning over. Now, I like to finish my yarn over by pointing the head of the hook up towards the ceiling, which is going to help us for our next step. So with our yarn over a hook, the head of our hook is pointing up. We're now going to rotate the hook towards us so that it points down. And with that hook, we're going to hook or catch the yarn in the hook's throat and bring it towards the place that we've inserted our hook and the other loop. So I'm going to hook that yarn, and I am going to keep pulling my hook towards the place where we've inserted our hook, and I'm going to pull this yarn through the place where we've inserted our hook. I'm not going to pull it through this loop, only the place that we've inserted our hook. So now my hook head is pointing down, and I've hooked that yarn, and I'm going to pull it through the place where we've inserted our hook. Now I'm going to rotate the hook up so that the head is pointing up. Now at this point, you can see that the loop that is now that we've just pulled through is in the hook's throat. We would like both of these loops to be on the shaft or the working area of the hook. So we're going to slide these onto the shaft. With our hook head pointing up, we're going to yarn over again, which means to bring our hook down and away from us, while at the same time pulling our yarn over our hook. Once again, it's falling over our hook from the bottom right to the top left. Now we're going to see the hook head is still pointing up. We're going to do the same thing we did before, which is rotate the hook towards the ground. And now we are going to catch or hook that yarn, and this time we're going to pull it through both of these loops that are on the working area of the hook. So I've now turned my hook so it's pointing down. I've hooked this yarn, and sometimes you need to pull these loops a little bit to make sure there's enough space for the yarn to come through these two loops. So now I'm going to pull this yarn through both loops on my hook. My hook head is still pointing down, and now I'm going to rotate it so it's pointing up and move that loop to the working area of my hook. And that completes my very first single crochet stitch. Let's make another single crochet stitch in the next chain. So I'm just going to take my hook out for a second and really look at where this next chain is. The single crochet stitch that we just made is in this chain right here, and it's created a bit of a gap, and that's normal. But when we look beside it, we can see that the next top loop of the chain is right beside where we've made the first single crochet stitch. And we're going to insert our hook underneath the top loop of the chain, and you can see that there's two strands below that make an X. These are the two strands below that make an X. So when we go to make our next stitch, we're going to insert our hook underneath that top loop of the next chain. So inserting our hook in underneath the top loop of the next chain. The head of the hook is facing us. Now we're going to yarn over by pushing our hook away from us and bringing our yarn over the hook. I like to make sure that the hook head is pointing up, at least while you're starting. As you get more experienced in crochet, you don't need to absolutely point it up, but this is a good way to make sure that you're hooking down and can catch your yarn. So now we're going to rotate the hook down, hook the yarn, and bring it through the place where we've inserted our hook. So hooking that yarn, pull that yarn through where we've inserted our hook, and then rotate our hook up. Bring them over to the working area, and let's proceed to the next step, which is to yarn over, bringing our hook under the yarn so the yarn falls on top, rotating it down, and now hooking that yarn and bringing it through both loops on our hook. And then rotated it back up. And now you can see that we've made 2 single crochet stitches. Let's do one more. Once again, we're going to work into the top loop of the next chain. So when we insert our hook, if you lift it up slightly, you can see an X right below it. So we're going to yarn over, rotate our hook down, and pull the yarn through where we inserted our hook, rotate it up, move our loops onto the working area, yarn over again, rotate our hook down, hook that yarn, and bring it through those 2 loops, and then rotate up. And now you simply repeat this process into each chain stitch all the way across. So you can go ahead and practice and put me on pause, but I want to show you how to single crochet in the last chain from the chain row, because sometimes it can be a little tricky to tell where you should be single crocheting into. So I'm at my last chain, and this last chain is connected to the slip knot that was made to start the chain row. And so you want to make sure that you're working into the chain and not the slip knot. So if we take a closer look at this, you can see this is our last single crochet stitch that we made. We're wanting to insert our hook under the top loop of this last chain, and there's the 2 strands that cross underneath. We do not want to be working into that slip knot. So working into that last chain, we do the exact same thing. Yarn over, bring our yarn through, yarn over, bring our yarn through both loops. And now we have a row of single crochet stitches. So we just completed a row of single crochet stitches by working under the top loop of each chain stitch. But I'd like to show you how to crochet in the back ridge loops. So the back ridge loops are on the back of the chain. So if you slightly rotate your chain row, you can see these bumps along the back. Now these bumps are smaller and a bit more tight than working into the top loop. But I highly recommend you learn how to single crochet or make any stitches into these back ridge loops, especially if you want to make baby blankets and have borders without unwanted gaps. You'll definitely want to work into these back ridge loops. And sometimes it's intimidating as a beginner, so the sooner you learn, and it's really easy, you just need to know where they are and how to work into them. So let's look and find the second chain from the hook. Once again, the loop on our hook does not count as a stitch. I'm just taking the hook out for a second to show you. So this loop is where our hook is, does not count. This first back ridge loop is the first chain from the hook. The second back ridge loop is the second chain from the hook. And the next one after that is the third chain from the hook. So it's exactly the same chain that you're working into. It's just in a different place in the chain. So before, when we made our first single crochet stitch in this second chain from hook, if we want to work into the back ridge loop, we simply twist our chain row, and we find that second bump from the hook. And into this bump, we are going to insert our hook into the bump. So this back bump is in the middle of those strands. Now these can be tight to work into, so you just have to do it carefully, or you can always use a different size hook while you're making your chains. Maybe you go up one hook size to make your chains, and then use a smaller hook to work into the back ridge loops. So this is where we're going to insert our hook. And then once we've inserted our hook, single crocheting is exactly the same, but let's do that together. So I've made my chain row. I'm getting my yarn all ready to go. And now I'm going to work into the back ridge loops, which means I rotate my work and I find that second bump and I insert my hook into it. Now I make sure that everything is on my working area. The head of my hook is facing me, and now I'm going to yarn over by pushing my hook away from me while at the same time pulling my yarn over the hook. I rotate the head of my hook up, and now I'm going to rotate it so the head of the hook is pointing to the ground. I'm going to hook my yarn and bring it through the place where I've inserted my hook, pull through, and then rotate up. Bring my loops onto the working area, yarn over again, yarn over, rotate my hook down, hook that yarn, and bring it through the 2 loops on my hook, and rotate up. Working into the back ridge loop creates the exact same single crochet stitch that we made when we worked into the top loop, but if you are going to be connecting, for example, a baby blanket border to these stitches, when you work into the back ridge loop, it creates less of a gap. And so therefore, a lot of designers and a lot of my baby blanket patterns have instructions to work into the back ridge loop when working into the chain. For the reason is that it doesn't, if you don't want unwanted gaps. Now, one thing I find that is easier about working into the back ridge loops is I find it's really easy to see where the next bump is. It's very evident after working in that bump that the next bump is the bump right next to it. And we're just going to do the exact same thing. Insert our hook into that bump, yarn up. Okay, so it's like this. Then we're going to yarn over, rotate our hook down, pull the yarn through, rotate up, yarn over, hook that yarn, and bring it through both loops on our hook and rotate up. So now I'm just going to single crochet into each back ridge loop all the way across the chain. You feel free to put me on pause and come back when you've done the same, but I do want to just spend a moment to show you how to work into the last back ridge loop before the slip knot, because sometimes it can be tricky to see. So I've just single crocheted all the way across, and there is 1 chain left. As you can see where my last stitch was, it's quite obvious that that was the chain that I worked into. And if you stretch your work, you can see that there is 1 chain left. And when you rotate it onto your back, on the back, you can see the back ridge loop there. But it's easy to mistake it for the slip knot. So just try to stretch or pull your work to really examine and make sure you're working into that last back ridge loop. And then you do the exact same thing, which is insert your hook under that back ridge loop, and then you single crochet. Let's talk about counting stitches. How do you count single crochet stitches? Well, there's a few ways you can do it. First is to count the tops of the stitches. So the last stitch that we made, pretend this is my hook, the last stitch we made was this one right here. And if you look at the top of this last single crochet stitches, you see 2 loops. This loop here is called the front loop. The front loop is always the loop that is facing us. The loop at the back is called the back loop. And that's always the loop that is furthest away from us. And each single crochet stitch at the top has these 2 loops. So if you look at the next stitch, you can see front loop and back loop, and that makes our second crochet stitch. The third loop, there's our front loop, there's our back loop. This makes our third single crochet stitch. So we can count them by counting the tops of those stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But let's look closely at where we started the row, because this one can be the most tricky to see. This is technically our first stitch, but as you can see, it's a little lower than the rest, and it's very close to the chain stitch that we skipped in order to single crochet in the second chain from hook. So this here is actually that first chain that we made that we did not work into, and that is the first stitch that we made in the row. So just make sure that when you're counting your single crochet stitches that you're not counting that chain unless instructed to in the pattern. So that's our first stitch, and counting all the way across, we have 9 stitches in total. Another way that you can count is by looking at what I call the legs of a single crochet stitch. So these are the top loops. This is the front top loop, that's the back top loop, and these are the legs. Each single crochet stitch has 2 legs. Let's look at the next stitch. So the next stitch, those are its 2 legs, and they're the top loops of the stitch. So I can, if I pull my work apart, I can see that the legs belong to that stitch and these legs belong to that stitch, and I can count them that way. So right now you can see 3 single crochet stitches right that I'm holding in between my nails. This is the row that we just completed, which was the first row. The first row, when you're doing any crochet pattern, is working into the chain row. And right now, our last stitch is on the left. So the last stitch that we made is the very last one here. And this was the first stitch that we made. Right now, the front of our work is facing us. In crochet, this is called the right side. Now that we've finished row 1, we are going to chain 1 and turn our work. I'm going to put my hook back into the working loop, which is on top of the last stitch that I made. And to chain 1, we are going to yarn over by taking our hook and putting it under the yarn, bringing our yarn on top of the hook, rotating it up, rotating the hook back down towards the ground, and hooking that yarn and bringing it through our loop that's on our hook. So I'm going to pull that yarn through my loop on my hook and then rotate it back up and onto the working area of the hook. Now I'm going to turn my work just like you're flipping a page in a book, where I just flip it. So this is the beginning of the row that is now going towards me and flipping it over. We've just chained 1 and turned, and now we're looking at the back of our work. This is the wrong side. Now don't be confused that it's the wrong side. We still are going to work into this side. Just the wrong side is another way to say the back of our work. Let's look at what's happening here. We have our working loop on our hook, and right underneath it is our chain 1 that we made. This chain 1 is not a single crochet stitch, and your pattern should indicate whether this chain 1 counts as a stitch or not. The next stitch beside it is the first stitch in the row, which is attached to the chain, but it's the last stitch from the previous row. What this means is before we turned our work, remember this was the last stitch that we made, and then we turned our work, and now it becomes the first stitch in the row. Now let's look at what's happening with our single crochet stitches, and that's slightly different from what we saw on the other side. So as a reminder, each single crochet stitches has these 2 legs, but when we flipped our work over, there's an extra element to these single crochet stitches. Each of them has 2 legs. These are the 2 legs, but I think of it like a person wearing a belt. These single crochet stitches, now that we're looking at them from the back, we can see an extra element, which is a belt, excuse me. So that's really important to know when we learn how to work into stitches. We are not going to be working into this belt, okay? It's really important to know that because I know I made a mistake in my crocheting early on. I always worked into this belt. Now some patterns may call for you to work into that belt, but that's much more advanced. We want to be working into the top loops of our single crochet stitches, not into that belt. So when we insert our hook, we are going to go under the front loop and under the back loop like this, not touching that belt. That belt is staying where it is. We're going under the front loop and the back loop. Those are the two top loops of a single crochet stitch, and we just leave the belt where it is. The pattern that you're working on will normally tell you whether or not you should work into this first stitch. This first stitch is the stitch that's attached to the chain. Some patterns say to skip it, some patterns say to work into it, and it also can depend on which stitch is the first stitch in the row. So for example, many patterns that call for a double crochet stitch will not be, they say not to work in that first stitch. But when making single crochet stitches, it is quite typical to work into that first stitch, the stitch that's attached to the chain. So when we go to work into that stitch, we're going to insert our hook under the front and back loop and ignore that belt. We're not going to touch that belt. So we're going to insert our hook under these two top loops. So I'm going to get my hook back into my work, and let's do this together. So there's my chain one stitch. Here are my top loops. I'm going to insert my hook under both loops. So this now becomes the place where I've inserted my hook. Remember when we were working into the chain row, there was only one loop when we inserted our hook. Now there is two. But how we single crochet is exactly the same. We're going to yarn over, rotate our hook down, and bring that yarn through those two loops. Rotate our hook up, move our loops onto the working area, yarn over again, and bring our yarn through both loops on our hook. Let's look at where to make our next stitch. And this I really think is the most common mistake, and I definitely made it because it looks so confusing. These looks like top loops, right? You could easily say that this is where you should be inserting your hook. But yeah, really have to look at where your stitches are and understand that the top loops are this front loop here, the back loop here, and this loop that is a little smaller than the two loops. This is the belt that doesn't get worked into. It helps if you spread your, pull your work apart a little bit, and then you can really see that there's a gap. And you see that the gap underneath the top two loops, and that's where you're going to want to insert your hook. So if you pull your work apart a little bit, you can see we want to insert our hook under these loops like that, leaving the belt where it is. Now yarn over, hook the yarn, bring the yarn through those loops, and yarn over again, pull the yarn through both loops on your hook. And then simply single crochet all the way across the row. And I will show you again. I hear a lot that it's hard to find that last stitch, so I'll just show you. So this is my last stitch here, and it really does get easier as you make more rows. It's just because we were working into the chain. So this last stitch here is a bit lower than the other ones were. So when we want to work into it, we are going to put our hook under the front loop and the back loop and leave the belt where it is and not touch. That was the chain that we skipped right there. So we're not going to work into that. So for the last stitch in the row, insert a hook under, and it can always be tighter, this last stitch, especially for the second row. Front loop under the back loop, just like that, leaving the belt where it is. And then we single crochet. One thing that can be confusing is this is technically a wrong side row. We've just finished row 2 and it is a wrong side row, but the front of our stitches are facing us. So it's important to understand the difference between having the front of the stitches facing you and what is a right side and wrong side row. So how you can tell if it's a right side or wrong side row is where the starting tail is. If the starting tail is on the right, it is a wrong side row. If the starting tail is on the left, it is a right side row. Now let's count our stitches. The last stitch that we completed, that's attached to the working yarn, is the last stitch that we completed in the row. And you can remember to tell them apart by where the loops are, or you can count by where the legs are. So if we count our stitches, I'll count from 1 here, even though this was the last stitch that we completed and this was the first one, but just for the sake of counting, we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then this last stitch here is this one with these 2 loops, which is the 9th. This here was the chain, and we are not going to count this little bump as a stitch. We only count the single crochet stitches unless the pattern says otherwise. So in this row, we have 9 stitches. Another question I get quite frequently is how to count rows. And this is where just keep looking at your stitches and really trying to understand the anatomy of them. Right now it's easy because we've only done 2 rows, but we can tell that one row has the belts and then the next row doesn't have the belts. So that's a way you can differentiate the rows, and as you make more rows of single crochet stitches, you can count by counting the belt row, non-belt row, belt row, non-belt row, and count all the way up so that you can count your rows. You can also stretch your work a little bit and then understand where the gaps are. Other tips are to use a row counter or stitch markers. There's lots of different ways, but I really think the sooner you can really tell the difference between the stitches, I think that will really help. Let's go through one more thing before we end this tutorial on single crochet. Once again, I'm going to chain 1 and turn. This is now a right side row with the front of our work facing us. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to make a regular single crochet in that first stitch. I'm going to pause here for a second because I want to show you how to work into the front loop and how to work into the back loop when you're single crocheting. So as you know, there's the front loop, which is a loop facing us, and the back loop, which is a loop furthest away from us. And note that this depends on which side of your work is facing you. So right now that's the front loop. I'm just going to keep my little needle there. But if you turn it, that front loop that we were looking at actually becomes the back loop. So in order to single crochet into the front loop only, what you will do is instead, this is not what we're going to do, instead of inserting our hook under both top loops, we're going to insert our hook under one loop only. And since we're going to do the front loop, it's the loop that's closest to us. So if your pattern calls to single crochet in the front loop only, simply insert your hook under that front loop only. See how I've left the back loop where it is? We don't touch the back loop. We just have one loop on our hook and then single crochet normally. If you want to, if your pattern calls for the back loop only, you're going to insert your hook on, you skip over the front loop and insert your hook under the loop that's furthest away, but still on the top of the stitch. So what you would do is insert your hook into the back loop only, leaving the front loop where it is, and then single crochet normally. And that concludes this video on how to single crochet. Thank you so much for watching.